Their crimes are unimaginable for most of us, not just taking one life, but taking one after another after another. From Jack the Ripper to present-day cases, what makes a serial killer? And can forensic profiles, new research, and big data really help authorities understand how and why they strike? To help us answer those questions, let's welcome, on the line from Los Angeles, California, Jim Clemente, a retired FBI profiler, writer, and producer of the television series Criminal Minds, host of 2 podcasts, Best Case, Worst Case, and Real Crime Profile. In Washington, D.C., Tim Clemente, a retired FBI special agent and counter-terrorism specialist, now a consultant, commentator, and writer for television, including several episodes of NCIS Los Angeles, and yes, indeed, those two are brothers. And in London, Ontario, Michael Arntfield, formerly a detective with the London Police Service, now a professor of criminology at Western University and founder of its Cold Case Society. And we are happy to welcome you 3 to our program for a subject that we all need to know a lot more about. And I'm going to start with Michael, because one of the reasons we're discussing this is that we've got our very own probable serial killer in Toronto right now, the Bruce McArthur case, which has been in the headlines so much as of late. An accused serial killer operating out of Toronto's gay village, 6 counts, first-degree murder. Let me get your view on this. Should authorities have known more sooner about the disappearance of so many men in one particular area of the city?
Well, immediately strikes me as unusual that you have, again, multiple disappearances involving people who otherwise are not significantly at risk or have an elevated risk factor. And that they're all from one community, and they seem to be clustering in not only in space but in time. And there's some noteworthy dates or times of the year that they were always disappearing. This is one of the early factors in this case that was identified online, and that my students even identified before we knew what we were dealing with. So in my mind, this should have been investigated as a series, as connected cases. And the investigation could have, in theory, proceeded that way until proven otherwise. And we see, in fact, that is the case, that they are connected and that it is a serial case.
I am inferring from your comments, Michael, that therefore lives could have been saved had this rolled out differently.
Well, I mean, hindsight is always, people are always going to Monday morning quarterback these investigations. This is in part why, again, I keep stressing this, the importance of bringing big data, a murder accountability project, and a missing persons database like the one I co-administer in the US to Canada, and which is why that project is now being funded with a grant and underway in Canada, is to use big data, optimize what we know based on the peer-reviewed research in order to identify these trends before it's too late and before further lives are lost.
Let's share some data now. Speaking of data from Canada, here's the Canadian profile on serial killers. There have been apparently 74 serial killers in Canada since the mid-19th century. 5 are confirmed female serial killers. That means almost 15% of Canadian serial killers are women. And there have been 6 confirmed and 9 suspected serial killers in London, Ontario, where you're talking to us from, Michael, between 1963 and 83, and we'll have more detail on that later. Let's get Jim Clemente into this discussion now. Do we know enough about the realm of profiling or criminal investigative analysis that would enable authorities to actually understand who has the potential of doing this and actually interrupt so-called serial killing before it becomes serial killing? What do you think, Jim?
Well, although we know a lot about the profile of serial killers, there's a spectrum of people on that continuum, basically. They differ in many ways, but the one similar construct is that they will kill 2 or more or 3 or more people in different events and basically not have any individualized motive for those crimes. The thing about it, though, is that people have free will. And although they could have all the markers, all the telltale signs, they may not ever act out on it. So it's a difficult thing to actually predict human behavior. The only true indicator of future human behavior is a past pattern of that behavior.
Tim, what would you add to that in terms of helping us understand what the commonalities are of serial killers?
One of the things I would bring into play is the cross-jurisdictional boundaries that makes it so difficult for law enforcement, and it makes it so much easier for these perpetrators. Whether you're committing murders, like in the DC sniper case where you're driving around and shooting people, or doing much closer bloodletting of criminal or of victims, the criminal that's doing that generally does it in multiple jurisdictions. And that makes it very difficult for different jurisdictions to realize what other jurisdictions may have happening in their areas. And so these individuals are therefore able to get away with it for a longer period of time because, as Michael said, the data is there, but it's not necessarily known by different jurisdictions, and it's not necessarily recognized as a serial crime or a relation between criminal behaviors because they don't see it happening in their backyard. It's happening in somebody else's backyard, and it's just not noticed because so many departments are so busy with their own crime, they can't look outside their boundaries to see what else might be happening that could be related.
Michael, at the risk of getting too graphic here, is there something about the way a serial killer disposes of the bodies that he or she kills that tells us something about who did it?
Very much so. And the FBI for decades has been collecting data on this, and there's 4 recognized what we call disposal pathways or methods by which the offender disposes of their victim afterwards. So, Jim talked about sort of the spectrum of offenders. This is the most effective way of delineating a suspect profile based on what was done with the victim, in that we have very consistent markers associated with each of these pathways. So pathway number 1 would involve transporting and concealing a victim, or otherwise burying or even dissolving or dismembering, obliterating the evidence, if you will, or ensuring that they're never found. Pathway number 2 is transportation and then just dumping at the roadside typically, or in public view somewhere. Pathway number 3 is leaving the body at the scene as is, at the primary crime scene, no transportation. And then pathway number 4, which is the most rare, involves disposing of the victim at the primary crime scene, usually the offender's residence or somewhere else that they have a privacy interest and control over.
And a quick follow-up, you know the allegation, of course, is that Bruce McArthur, the Toronto example, fits the first of those criteria that you just put out. Could you just add to that briefly?
Again, alleged serial killer Bruce McArthur, if in fact this is correct, so these allegations are proven true, would fit pathway number 1, and he would be, the average age for pathway number 1 is 24 to 43. So he's significantly older than the dozens of offenders who have used this method previously and who are on file. But he does fit the profile in a number of other ways. What's interesting is 100% of offenders who, on record, who use this method are employed full-time and are Caucasian. Again, 43 is the upper end of the age range, but we know for a number of reasons that, again, alleged killer McArthur is anomalous in a number of ways. And I'm going to suggest, and I've been stressing this publicly, that the sophistication and the organization seen in his disposal method, and the brazenness, quite frankly, suggests that he's been at this for some time. So at one point in time, he was probably in that optimal age range of 24 to 43. And that's why I'm suggesting police need to start looking back 20, 30 years at where he was, and then start cross-referencing cases.
Okay, Jim Clemente, let me get you to, yeah, sorry, you
Can I
wanted to
add
add.
to that?
Please.
Yeah, I did. I would add another disposition methodology, and that would be displayed. And that's somebody who actually deliberately takes a body to a certain location, or even leaves it at the location of the death, but displays it in a manner in which it attempts to degrade the person or shock the person who finds it. So it's another level of disposition that we always look at. Also, there are ways to put a victim in a transportation modality. For example, throwing a victim into a river, and that river could take the body miles or hundreds of miles away, or in the ocean. And so that's another way. So we look at concealment as temporary concealment or permanent concealment, and also concealment that can actually move the body to a new disposition
Tim, could
site.
you take us to the opposite end of the age spectrum, and let me ask you about a school shooter. Does a teenage school shooter fit the profile of a serial killer?
Typically, that's a
They
mass-
can. I mean,
Oh, we've got an issue here
yeah,
because we've
that
got
would be a mass shooter.
Tim and Jim.
Yeah.
You have names that sound very similar. So let's go
All
to.
right.
Why don't
Yes.
I help by saying Tim in Washington? Could you pick up on that?
Okay. Sure. Yeah. One of the things you have with these school shooters is first of all, they classify as mass killers, not necessarily serial killers, because it's one contained event, usually when they're doing something, killing their classmates or kids in the school. And, you have the psychopathy. These could be psychotic individuals. We see that most of the kids that are doing these shootings have some form of mental illness, and it's sometimes treated. Sometimes they've gone off their treatment, gone off medication. Other times it's not being diagnosed or treated at all. But that seems to be the commonality, and I would assume that most serial killers are not acting sanely, so there probably is a pattern of mental illness for most mass shooters as well as most serial killers.
And Jim in California, let me get you to follow up with this question here. Besides the obvious difference of gender difference, is there a difference between male and female serial killers?
Sure there is, both in their disposition methodologies and their kill methodologies. Typically, women will favor water burials, for example, whereas men will favor dirt burials. In terms of killing, women will favor poisoning, whereas men will favor manual violence and knives and guns. So there are some outliers on both sides of that, but we can generally distinguish between the type of offender, the gender of the offender, by how they kill and where they dispose of the bodies.
And Tim in Washington, can you tell me, in your view, whether or not you think serial killers are made or born?
I think it's a combination of the two. Obviously, when we're talking about if there's mental illness that's involved, that could be something that's genetic. And I think the environment they're bred in, that they're brought up in, can affect that. Some people may have the same mental illnesses but never become violent, and the environment might be the thing that triggers them, whether they're very violently abused, sexually abused as a child or as a youngster. That can affect future behavior. You have a wide variety of individuals that have become serial killers, so there's no absolute norm. But in my opinion, it's a combination of the two.
And Michael, let's get you to follow up on, how much of what you do is art and how much of it is science. Where would you put the preponderance of percentage in that case?
You know what? It's a little bit of both. I tend to favor the scientific method, obviously, as an academic. And this is in part where profiling has sort of gone off the rails a little bit. You've got, due to the mass public interest in this topic, you have a lot of self-professed profilers, and that includes police officers who in many cases, and there's a court decision involving the OPP back in 2003 on this, have no business rendering profiles, or they're certainly not rooted in the scientific method. So, I mean, that's why the disposal pathways that I just cited are really a good barometer of distinguishing offender subtypes, in that as Jim mentioned, the best indicator of future behavior is past behavior with respect to similar offenses. So when we see, for instance, that 60% of offenders who use disposal pathway number 1 don't know their victims, that they're strangers or targeted strangers, and that about half have a prior criminal record, I mean, those are good places then to start, because that is verifiable data that is gleaned from previous offenders. So you're not just sort of cooking up a theory, you're using existing information to essentially carve out what is the most likely scenario. And that's why I think it's a little bit of both art and science, but it should be more science, and I'm really advocating for that.
Well, let's do a specific example here. And Tim in Washington, D.C., I'll start with you, because I think it was you who referenced a few moments ago the D.C. sniper case that both you and your brother worked on. Why don't you start that, and then we'll get Jim in California to pick up on that, because you two, I gather, worked in tandem on that case and brought your different strengths and locations to helping resolve that. Tim in D.C., why don't you start?
Sure. Well, that was a case that hit very close to home for both Jim and I and everyone in the Washington, D.C. area. We were both operating out of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, living in Virginia. Our hometown, Fredericksburg, Virginia, had a couple of the homicides or the shootings from the D.C. sniper case. And as I mentioned earlier, crossing jurisdictional boundaries made it a lot easier for the D.C. snipers to move around and get away with what they did. Also, there was some inept policing done. A profile was given on the type of vehicle that was used that was totally wrong, and it was a misdirect for eyewitnesses. But I worked as an FBI sniper, so we were out as counter snipers looking for these individuals day and night. And I was also working with the Human Scent Recovery Team of the FBI, which is our highly trained and very specifically trained bloodhound teams that are used to search for physical evidence. After we have a scent to use, we can direct the dogs. And it was very helpful. Actually, we gained the most critical evidence in the investigation, the demand note, shell casings, and sniper shooting positions at the times where the shooter was outside the vehicle. My brother Jim, on the other hand, in Los Angeles, was working on the behavioral side, and I'll let him take it from here on what they did on the profiling of the behavior of what was seen based on the crime scenes and based the behavior of the crimes themselves.
Over to you, Jim.
Yeah, at the time I was in the Behavioral Analysis Unit in Quantico, Virginia, and we were looking at the evidence that Tim found, the notes, the tarot card and the 3 or 4 page note that were left at different crime scenes. And the interpretation of that was actually very anomalous. Basically, in general, snipers have a God complex and they don't work well with others. And so typically the profile of a sniper would be a lone actor. And this guy was so good. In fact, one day he shot 6 different people at 6 different locations and nobody saw him at all. So that's perfect planning and execution. He didn't break down in terms of over time. The adrenaline rush from the first few shootings didn't make him make mistakes at the several other shootings that he made. So we saw him as an older individual, somewhere in his mid-40s to mid-50s, somebody who also had experience under fire. And yet his writing seems to indicate that he was a teenager. So for the first time in history, we said, basically by the profile, that because his writing indicated juvenile and his execution of the shootings indicated an older person, that for the first time in U.S. history, we had a sniper team. And when we adjusted the profile to fit that, within 24 hours, this sniper team was actually arrested.
And Tim, just take, in D.C., just take another 20 seconds or so and tell us, why did this happen? What was the motive?
Well, apparently the motive was John Muhammad was divorced and wanted to get custody of his children, so he plotted to kill his wife. But knowing that as an ex-husband he would be the primary suspect and immediately looked at by law enforcement, he decided he would do some random killings in the area and then kill his wife, who I believe was living in Maryland at the time. And she would just be one of many victims. He would not necessarily then be a suspect. And I think what happened is the bloodlust he got from these killings, which actually began before they got to the Washington, D.C. area, got to him, and then there was a ransom demand to stop the killing. And I think it was just that God complex that my brother Jim just mentioned came into play, and he really felt like God, which was referenced in the notes. And I think the original plot kind of went out the window, and he just liked to kill.
Now, Michael, let me take you to the city that you are in, London, Ontario, but of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, for an extremely strange case of serial killing in a relatively small town over a relatively long period of time. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I mean, that phenomenon is detailed in my book, Murder City, about London, Ontario, which is really, a outlier in terms of Canadian cities with respect to serial homicide, both as a criminological phenomenon and then also with respect to how the media and the police responded to that. So in London, the book begins in 1959 for some other reasons and looks at some related cases in Canada, but really the period in question is from 63 to 83, and you have 6 confirmed, and as I hypothesize in the book, as many as 9 serial killers operating concurrently. and in fact, in many cases simultaneously, as you said, Steve, a relatively small city. But, I mean, as I state in the book, if London were to have had the population of New York City at that time, based on the serial killer to citizen ratio, you're talking about 80 serial killers walking the streets of, for instance, New York at any given time. And I mean, if you can imagine that's what London was dealing with. And there's no single explanation as to why this happened. It's a confluence of circumstances, socioeconomic issues, logistical issues in terms of the city's placement with respect to highways. And really that's the first sort of case we see in Canada of the interjurisdictional killer on the road. And a lot of killers came to London exploiting the 400 series highways and were gone again before the bodies were even found. And then you have some issues with respect to how the police department in the city was managed and what have you. But really an exceptional case, and something that, I mean, the whole reason behind the book is what can we learn from this, and how do we prevent that from happening again in other cities?
Well, let me pick up on that. That seems like a good spot to go. I want to go to the Clemente brothers on that in our remaining few moments here. Tim in D.C., why don't you pick up on that? What can people do to enhance their odds of not being the victim of a serial killer?
Well, I think one of the things we've seen, learning from the years of observing these crimes, is that many of the victims put themselves in situations where they're vulnerable. And that means they're either transient, homeless, working as prostitutes. That seems to be the vast preponderance of the victim pool, is that there's somebody that's not easily noticed that they're missing. So if you're putting yourself into a lifestyle where you're going to be out alone, out in remote locations, and out doing things where nobody knows where you are every minute of the day, you are more likely to be victimized by these types of killers. They look for easy prey, and the easiest prey is that which is alone, isolated, and not going to be noticed immediately when they're missing.
And what do you think, Jim, in California, what is still to be done in terms of expertise to get better at catching these people before they can wreak as much havoc as they'd like to?
Well, I think the programs in schools now that are actually people are pursuing master's and doctorate degrees in forensic psychology, for example, I think that's going to increase the awareness and the use of science. But I also think that because this is an art and a science, I think experience is the most, educational thing anybody can do. In the behavioral analysis unit, we typically studied and consulted on about 1,500 cases a year, and that builds up in your brain, which I believe is a scientific mechanism. In your brain, the details, the nuances of these different cases. But what law enforcement can do to help is to put all their cases into VICAP or VICLAS so that everybody in law enforcement will have access to the data, so that even when somebody goes cross-jurisdictional, that information is available to other jurisdictions so that they can actually identify serial killers much earlier.
And Tim in D.C., in our last 30 seconds here, I know you've been asked this a million times, but I'm also sure our viewers want to know the answer to this too. How did two brothers end up in the same line of work, such an odd line of work as well?
Well, we were basically from our early youth both inclined to serve, and my brother Jim went into prosecution first. He worked as a prosecutor in New York. I went into law enforcement as a regular police officer with the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. And then we both made our way into the FBI, although on opposite ends of the law enforcement spectrum. Him working in the ethereal world of profilers, me working on the ground, catching criminals both in the narcotics world and then counter-terrorism. So we have different points of view coming into law enforcement, and then we come out of it with different experience levels. So it's a small world. We both, though, because of that desire to serve, ended up in the FBI, which is the pinnacle of law enforcement in the United States and one of the top in the world.
Jim, you're not twins, are you?
To be able to have done it.
No, we're not. We're Irish twins. We're actually born within the same year, but we're 11 months apart.
Who's older?
I am.
Okay. Don't take this the wrong way, Tim, but I would not have guessed that. You've
Yeah.
got a few more gray hairs.
Everybody
He's got
says
9
that.
kids.
Yeah, everybody.
Oh, well, that'll do it.
I have 9 children.
That'll definitely do it.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. Well, Jim Clemente in Los Angeles, California, and Tim Clemente in Washington, D.C., and Michael Arntfield at Western University in London, Ontario. We're so grateful to all three of you for spending so much time with us on TVO tonight. And Jim, we're going to ask you to hang in there because we're going to have you come on the program a little bit later and tell us some more about something else as well. So thanks so
Great.
much, you three.
All right, take care. Thanks for having us.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.